Douglas County is the second fastest growing county in Colorado, but its main water source is drying up.
For the first time in decades, maybe ever, the city of Colorado Springs is having to carefully consider how much water we have when deciding whether to annex new land.
The Southwest is in a 22-year drought. The main reservoirs on the Colorado River only a quarter full.
These reservoirs are now being sucked dry by 40 million different straws. That's the number of people in booming western states who depend on the Colorado.
The situation along the Colorado River is dire, and I'm not sure it's going to get better ever.
Exactly how screwed are we?
Those are just a few of the dozens, maybe hundreds of news reports about the Colorado River. Of course, it's a big one. But we're in the midst of pumping numerous rivers, lakes, and aquifers dry around the world.
In this episode, we'll focus on the American Southwest as we talk with Gary Wockner, an expert who dares to tell the full truth.
Cities and states in the Southwest suffer from moderate to severe growth addiction. And when you couple that with an increasingly hot and dry climate, left untreated, the condition could be fatal. Who are you going to call?
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Thanks for calling. You're listening to the GrowthBusters podcast.
The costs of growth are killing us, literally.
Yes. So on this podcast, we talk about limits to growth and ecological overshoot.
Which we're in.
And that's driven by overpopulation, overconsumption, and our addiction to economic growth.
I'm Stephanie Gardner, environmental law and policy fanatic and sustainable energy pro.
And I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth. Beautiful lives on a healthy planet. That's what we're after.
And if you are too, please follow this podcast and share it with everyone you know, the growth afflicted and especially the growth addicted. Get them into a 12-step program.
So, Gary, you have a pretty impressive history of water advocacy, years and years and years. I don't know how far back it goes. When did you start?
It's been about 20 years of directly involved in water advocacy, and really river protection is what I would say I am more than anything.
It's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So you're the author of several books: River Warrior, Fighting to Protect the World's Rivers, Come Back Wolves, Pulse of the River, and several others. You founded and continue to be active with Save the Colorado and Save the Pooter. You also work globally as an advocate and consultant for protection of rivers. Impressively, you're the director of the Colorado River chapter of CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. You participated in staving off fracking activity in Fort Collins, Colorado. Did you found, or are you just directing Tell the Damn Truth?
I co-founded that, yeah.
That's a nonprofit that supports river protection groups by engaging with federal and state agencies to make sure that the greenhouse gas emissions caused by dams and reservoirs are counted, reported, and then considered during policymaking, rulemaking, and legislation, right?
Yeah.
And we'll get into more detail about this in a little while, but you most recently led opposition to the Northern Integrated Supply Project in Colorado. You filed a lawsuit to stop it. When did you file that lawsuit?
The lawsuit was filed about a year and a half ago.
And you just recently settled the suit, and so we want to give you a chance later on to share a little bit about that and what you ended up getting in that process.
Okay.
Very impressive credentials.
Yeah, so let's get into the conversation. What do the public and policymakers need to know about water in the American Southwest?
I would say the most important things are that the vast majority of water that we use, whether it's in your house or your lawn or the food you buy, that the water is used on a farm, comes from rivers. You know, in other parts of the country, you can pump water out of the ground. You can do that here, too, in Colorado and the southwest U.S., but a vast majority of the water comes from rivers. And so if you're turning on the faucet, you are taking water out of a river. And, you know, we live in a semi-arid state here in the state of Colorado. And, of course, the further south and west you go, it even becomes an arid state and a desert state, Arizona, Southern California. And so there's less and less water, and there's fewer and fewer rivers. And those rivers are under extreme stress because of human use and overuse, as well as a drying climate. And so rivers are what make life possible here in the southwest U.S. and state of Colorado in many ways, and they are under extreme stress. And so I try to protect and restore rivers, which is kind of a crazy thing to do in a very dry place because, it's job security if you can find the work, you might say. But it's a little bit crazy, too, because, there's constant proposals for new dams and diversions, which keep me on my toes.
Would you say that we tend to forget that we have to share the water in those rivers with other species, too?
Oh, absolutely. Most members of the public probably don't even know that the water comes from rivers. And despite their water utility trying to educate them about that, they don't know. And then, of course, we share the rivers with all the other critters that depend on this for survival. And so that's not just wildlife walking around on the ground. That is also aquatic species, fish and all sorts of critters, as well as, what we call riparian species, all the plant species that grow along rivers. And so, in the state of Colorado, if you get in an airplane and you're flying out of DIA, you'll see a green corridor and going in all sorts of directions. And those green corridors are rivers flowing across the landscape. Those are what people use to survive, but also non-human species, including plant and animal species. So we share it all. People are notoriously very bad at sharing, and we're bad at that here in the state of Colorado as well.
Yeah. So what has the evolution of the water topic looked like over the past, let's say, 50 years? I know that starting in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about a mega drought. And then more recently, there was, I think, a lot of coverage around Colorado River volumes and dam levels. So can you kind of help orient us in terms of what has happened and where are we today in the context of the Southwest?
Sure. Well, specifically, most states in the Southwest, including Colorado, have laws around the management of water and rivers. And those laws are mostly designed to get the water out of rivers. In the state of Colorado, we have Colorado Water Law, we have Colorado Water Court, and the whole process was historically designed solely and simply to get water out of rivers so that humans could use it either for farms or mining. A lot of it used to be used for mining, but now it's mostly farms and cities. And so you have this historical, precedent, which is not just a political precedent, it's also legal precedent, and it's financial precedent. And it has one goal, and that's to get the water out of rivers. And when you take water out of a river in the state of Colorado, it's called a beneficial use, literally and legally. If you leave the water in the river, it's called a non-consumptive use, and it's considered to be wasted. So the law literally forces, in some ways, the water to come out of rivers. And so that's been that way for well over 100 years. Over the last 50 years, specifically, we have what's called over-appropriation. So most of the rivers, all of the water that can be taken out of them has been taken out of them. And in the state of Colorado is one example. If a river still goes all the way to the state line with either Nebraska or Kansas or New Mexico or Utah flowing west or even north, a few flow into Wyoming, they usually only have water in them if there's a federal law requiring that amount of water to cross the boundary so the other state can be using it. And so Colorado is very judicious at trying to drain all the water out of the rivers it possibly can before the state line.
Wow.
And so in the last 50 years, the rivers have become what's called over-appropriated. There's more potential uses for them than there is actually water in the rivers. And so in sometimes really wet years, most of the water users will get water, but in dry years, a lot of the water users won't get water because there's not enough water because the water has to cross the state line. So in the last 20 years, back to your second part of your question, Stephanie, 25 years, there has been, what we call a mega drought in the Southwest United States, especially in the Colorado River Basin. And there's also been increasing use of water. And so those two things have collided to create this, management, political and legal and financial chaos around the entire Colorado River system, which is ongoing right now. And you probably just saw an article in the Denver Post about it, about how all the states are trying to negotiate a new agreement. They're farther apart from possible than they could be or should be, and the federal government might have to jump in and make everybody mad, or they could just end up in a big fight with each other and go to the Supreme Court, and the court has to decide. So, that kind of just ongoing chaos continues to ramble around the state of Colorado and the southwest United States, and it's only getting worse because there's less water, there's more people, and there's more arguments over about how the water is going to get used.
Well, I wanted to mostly, not completely, but mostly confine our conversation to the American Southwest because it does seem like it's really one of the most critical places where water is not in abundant supply, and yet people seem to be moving to the American Southwest in droves still, and the cities don't seem to be behaving as though they see the writing on the wall. They're still competing for more businesses to move there and more people to move to those cities. They can't get the habit of growth out of their system.
Absolutely. Most importantly, everyone needs to remember that the vast majority of the water that's drained out of rivers in the state of Colorado and the southwest United States goes to farms. The farms divert the water out of the rivers. There's farm districts, it's a massive, millions of acres of farms are irrigated because they divert water out of rivers, pump it out of rivers, pump it up over hills, pump it over the Continental Divide, etc., and it goes to farms. Somewhere between 75 and 80% of all the water that gets drained out of rivers, even the Colorado River, goes to farms. And so the cities come along and they grow and grow and grow and keep growing, and they need more and more water. And so they either have to get more water out of rivers or they buy it from the farmers. So it's either the rivers or the farmers are going to pay the price. When farmers stop farming, generally, they get paid to stop farming. Rivers, though, don't get paid. There are some caveats to that, which we can talk about the settlement we reached in Fort Collins around the Poudre River. But historically, if you wanted to drain water out of a river, you just filed some paperwork in the state of Colorado with the state water court system, and they gave you a right, which is another sheet of paper, and you drained the water out of the river. And the river got nothing in return. There's no balance sheet. There's no spreadsheet. There's no nothing. You just drained the water, and that was how it worked. On the other hand, if you want to get water from a farmer, you have to buy the water. Of course, the water is more and more expensive, and so the farmers have tremendous assets. Water is, in many cases, worth more than the land that the farm sits on, and so it's a phenomenally lucrative, exchange usually when cities buy farm water, and that's going on across the state of Colorado every year, and including around the southwest United States as well.
Well, is that a win-win then? The cities get to grow their population and the farmers get their money and everybody goes away happy?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. I think some of the farmers see it as a win. Some of them, they kind of see their irrigation, their water, as their 401k, and they sell it, and, what they do with their money is their business, whether they retire or whatever. So it's a common situation. A lot of farm communities and farm businesses and the farm culture don't usually see it as a win-win because it means the diminishment of irrigated agriculture, and of course it is. The cities probably see it as a win. Of course, I'm a river protection environmentalist, so of course I don't usually see it as a win.
Yeah.
I just see it as more pressure on the landscape, more pressure on the rivers, more pressure on wildlife, more crowding, more density, et cetera, things that you're probably more used to talking about. But, I think the cities, I want to make sure I leave you with a few important points. Growth in the state of Colorado and really across the southwest United States, and really in many ways in the United States, but especially here in Colorado, it's almost like an artificial intelligence. I would say it's like baked into the entire political apparatus. And so, do the cities see it as a win? Yes, to the extent that they're conscious beings.
Yeah.
But mostly it's just like the growth machine, which I often call it. It just exists to grow. It doesn't really know anything else. And it's baked into the entire political apparatus. And so that's what it does. It is very much like an artificial intelligence, I think, that we've gotten so used to we don't question anymore. And of course, I'm not a young fella, and so I grew up, in the 70s and 80s and kind of a different world than we have now, different in the state of Colorado as well. But, environmentalists back then used to commonly talk about growth and population growth, which, you never really see environmental groups do nowadays. There's very few that actually do that. And you mentioned, of course, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, which is based back in D.C., and a good friend of ours runs it named Brian Check. Other than him and a few others, there's very little pushback anymore from growth. And, I want to leave you even with the more provocative concept. In many ways, the state of Colorado, it's more a real estate development than it is an actually government entity. I mean, if you follow a lot of state politics, and especially the vast majority of local politics, it's all about how growth's going to happen, where it's going to happen, who's going to pay for it, how much we're going to subsidize it, how fast we're going to fuel it, et cetera, et cetera. And so growth is just baked into the entire culture and economy and the political apparatus of the state of Colorado across the state. And, it kind of ebbs and flows a little bit depending on, how the economy ebbs and flows as well. But growth is like an algorithm, and it's baked in. And, if you want to challenge that, you're definitely outside the dominant paradigm pretty far.
Meanwhile, the Colorado River, does it ever even trickle into the Gulf of Mexico?
No, the United States diverts about 90% of the water out of the Colorado River. The other 10% crosses the international boundary of Mexico, and Mexico immediately takes the last 10%. And so the Colorado River, all nearly 5 trillion gallons, no longer meets the sea. It hasn't really met the sea in any consequential way in decades. And so, when you talk about all the economic growth that the Colorado River has created and supports, it's because the river itself has been environmentally devastated. And if you actually go down to the thing called the Colorado River Delta, which is where the river used to meet the sea, there used to be 2 million acres of wetlands there, 2 million acres. It was almost as far as the eye can see. Now when you go down there, it's almost sand dunes or a certain just kind of piles of sediment as far as the eye can see. Now there's a few places, 10,000 acres here, 10,000 acres there, and it's all human manipulated that's caused it to still be there. But it has an ecological devastation that we take for granted, and people don't even really, conceive of anymore. But it used to be the largest wetland in North America, one of the biggest intercontinental flyways for migratory birds, and really a phenomenal resource. Aldo Leopold, one of the quote unquote fathers of the American environmental movement, was down there in 1922, which is actually the same year that the Colorado River Compact was signed. And he called it a land of milk and honey, which was just wetlands and wildlife and vegetation as far as the eye could see. And you could just literally get lost in it, quite literally, when he went through it in a canoe over 100 years ago. It's gone completely.
Wow.
So that's a buzzkill. I realize we've depressed everyone.
I'm going to go cry.
But that's the story of the American Southwest.
BRB.
Yeah.
So, Gary, that was very enlightening, but very depressing. So I assume that there's something that people have been doing and could be doing to try and combat this situation. So maybe we can talk about that.
Well,
or is it going to be more depressing news?
Yeah, there are efforts, but I would say that the overwhelming trajectory is only getting worse. There's efforts in the Colorado River Delta to try to restore some wetlands there. There's a whole thing kind of going on now. Again, it's in the tens of thousands of acres as opposed to 2 million, which is what it was. There's also efforts in the state of Colorado, various efforts to try to keep water in rivers here and there and try to create stream management plans that make rivers as healthy as they can be given the chaos that people are causing on rivers. Dave mentioned that I'm directing an organization called Save the Pooter up in Fort Collins. It's an organization that's been for 20 years, fighting dams and reservoirs up there. They're trying to divert more water out of the river. And we recently reached an agreement with a large-scale dam and diversion project that would let the project to go forward in exchange for us dropping our federal lawsuit against it. In addition, we established a $100 million, for lack of a better word, mitigation fund that would be spent on river improvements. There's a whole long story behind that, but I kind of see it as, northern Colorado is one of the fastest growing places in the United States. And you can beat your head against that concrete wall. And I'm a dam fighter, so I know what it's like to beat my head against concrete walls. You can do that for a long time. But at some point you have to, kind of stare reality in the eyes and say, okay, what can we do here? It's a bit of triage, but at the same point, you got to try to make some kind of improvement, or you got to take some kind of action that tries to save what we can while we can. And so I would say that, my work and my organizations try to keep rivers alive, try to improve them, but in many ways you're trying to save what you can while you can in a place that is under increasing threat of population growth and, humans trying to further drain and destroy rivers, as well as the climate drying out if you go farther south and west. So I'm not going to tell a super optimistic story, but you do what you can, and I think I've made a difference in some places, trying to work with a difficult situation and get a solution that at least, tries to save some percent of the flows in the rivers or keep the ecological processes so that they're moving forward, etc.
So your struggle and your lawsuit to prevent the Poudre River from being dammed, I'm assuming it's not the only dam, but having another dam put on that river, you settling the lawsuit was not letting perfect be the enemy of the good? You figured that was as good as you were going to get?
We got the best outcome we could for the river. And it's been 20 years, and it's been a big part of my career. And it included some sleepless nights, and over the last 6 to 9 months of kind of wrestling with this idea of settling the lawsuit and trying to get an outcome for the river that we could live with. We did that. I mean, the alternative, you can run through the tape on federal lawsuits, and I've made some progress in some places. I've also lost, in other places. And when you lose, it's over. And I wouldn't say this is devastating, but it's quite a feeling to see just 10 years of your work disappear when you lose. So it was important to me that we didn't have that outcome on the Poudre River, because we could have lost everything and got absolutely nothing. It was also important, I think most importantly, for the community of Fort Collins, which the river flows right through town. The town is built around the Cache de the Poudre River, and, it's really kind of the heart and soul of the community in many ways. And we had 1,000 donors in Fort Collins and a big community of followers, and, people supported the work. In Fort Collins, you stand up and say, save the Poudre, and, it's like, you're a cool guy. You're a great guy in town. And so it was a really easy job, and it was enjoyable, and it brought me a lot of joy. And so I think it was important for just the community itself that we got the best outcome we could get for the river. And we had something to show for that. 20 years. It was a 20-year-long battle. So we really wanted something to show for it that the community could at least say, well, we got something out of this, and it could actually improve the river if the money is spent wisely. And there's a long story about how to spend money wisely, but $100 million is a lot of money, and there may be more that, gets joined with that, through other philanthropic endeavors, etc. But at least provides some optimism and a kind of hope. And now there's a team of people. I'm not one of the members of the team on purpose, but there's a team of 6 people who are going to be working hard deciding how the money gets spent to try to, mitigate the damage caused by all the dams and diversions and hopefully help improve the river.
Now, some people might think that you dam a river and that's great for economic growth and meeting the needs of people, and it's only going to disappoint some tree huggers who are crying tears over some critters, and that's what do you call that? Collateral damage. That's just a necessary loss. And in fact, I think a lot of our history of the settling of the West, that seemed to be, in fact, I don't think any thought was given to what we were doing to nature. And certainly no one thought that nature had rights. I think that's changing, thanks in no small part to the work of people like you. That's bad enough that we're ravaging nature, but also we can't just keep building bigger dams. You look at the Colorado and what's going on in the two biggest reservoirs. I think they're the two biggest reservoirs in the country, aren't they? Lake Mead and Lake Powell?
Yeah, Mead and Powell are the two biggest reservoirs in the United States. I want to go back just a second to, something Stephanie brought up about over the last 50 years. It's true that the water development, schemes, whatever you want to call them, have escalated. It's also true at the same time in the state of Colorado and southwest United States, we've seen a dramatic demographic shift. Now, we can also talk about, how the demographic shift is more people, but it's also changed the culture. There's really, I would call a New West versus an Old West phenomenon that's happened in the western United States, and especially the state of Colorado, where the New West is younger people. They appreciate nature. They want to be out in nature much more. They see nature as an amenity for their recreational interests and spiritual use and joy, rather than a resource to be extracted. Specifically around rivers, we've seen the exact same kind of shift from an Old West viewpoint around rivers, which is drain and destroy them, to a New West concept around rivers, which is try to protect them and also to appreciate the amenity and the recreational opportunity. In the state of Colorado, as you know, and also in downtown Fort Collins, you see it in downtown Denver. There is a whitewater park, and you have one, of course, upstream from you there on the Arkansas River in Salida. And there's quite a few whitewater parks around the state of Colorado. And a new one was just built on the Cache the Poudre River in Fort Collins. Now, interestingly, right at the site where the whitewater park is now built, and I was just there on Friday with a journalist doing a big story about, the change in the river and the change in the community over the last 50 years, used to also be the city dump. In the Old West, the dumps were on riverbanks, and that was very common. The river was a place where you dumped your trash, and it flowed in the river and went away. It was a very common thing. And so the city dump has been, excavated. This is many years ago, 20 years ago, and the Environmental Protection Agency came in and put a huge barrier all the way along the river to keep the pollution from flowing into the river. And now it's a park and a big recreation center. And then about 5-6 years ago, a brand new whitewater park for boaters and kayakers and tubers was built right in downtown Fort Collins. And so it's a really classic example. Hey, I'm being more optimistic now, Stephanie. See,
Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's a classic example of kind of the New West, the demographic shift, which is towards appreciating nature, recreating in nature, finding spiritual joy in nature, as opposed to the Old West, which was more solely and simply about extracting resources and getting money for those. So we've definitely seen that as the population has grown. As you guys know, a lot of the growth we've seen in Colorado is younger people, and they're more recreationally minded. The other side of that is the trailheads are all packed on the weekends, and we run into all sorts of challenges that way too.
Yeah.
But we definitely have a New West shift here in the state of Colorado, and that has actually helped the story. The state has gotten involved and funded recreational opportunities and stream management plans that protect the ecology and try to protect and restore recreational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not all bad news. There is some good news, but the threats and the challenges are only increasing, with more and more people and more need for water.
Tell us a little bit about Lake Powell and Lake Mead.
Sure. Well, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and old school environmentalists like to call them Reservoir Powell and Reservoir Mead, because they're not lakes, they're not natural. And so you have to remind people all the time that it's not a pretty lake that just sitting there, it's always been there. Those are two reservoirs, the two biggest reservoirs in the United States. They're both also hydroelectric plants at both of the dams, Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam. Mm-hmm. And they're both, nearing what's called dead pool, where the water can get so low where it can no longer generate hydroelectricity. And that creates all sorts of problems. In addition to electricity problems, it creates problems for just trying to get the water to flow out of the dams through the river anymore. Interestingly, between those two dams, Glen Canyon Dam on Powell Reservoir and Hoover Dam on Mead Reservoir, is one of the most iconic places on the planet, the Grand Canyon. And the ecology of the Grand Canyon has been I'm going to do a buzzkill here quick, Stephanie, again. The ecology in the Grand Canyon has been dramatically depleted and changed because of the two dams that really bookend it. And so, a lot of the discussion that you're seeing in the newspaper right now, including in the Denver Post 2 days ago, is all about the reservoirs and the threat to the reservoirs and the threat to the hydroelectricity. Hardly anybody ever talks about the ecological damage and the threats to the Colorado River flowing through the Grand Canyon. So me, just because I'm kind of a malcontent, I always try to talk about the things that people don't want to talk about, which is like the ecological health of the Colorado River. And so I'm just perpetually saying, well, that's interesting. I understand the plight of the farmers and what they're trying to do. And oh, yes, that's interesting. I understand the cities are growing. They have all these challenges. But what about the ecological health of the river itself that we have drained and depleted and continues to be on life support as well? And so, that's the kind of story that I always bring to the table. And that's why when I walk into a room, people, usually they don't invite me into the room, or they just like, uh-oh. They're like, oh, here he comes again. And we're just going to have to listen to him go on and on about the ecology of the river and et cetera, et cetera. But that's my job. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, we need your voice, Gary.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, you're a conservationist and a river protector and a ecologist in so many ways. So I know that the three of us know that we live on a planet that can't sustainably support 8 billion and growing human numbers, that the real number of humans on the earth need to be closer to 2 billion or probably even less than that. So globally, we don't need more people, we need fewer people. But let's just talk about the American Southwest. Isn't it true, would you say it's true today that there already are more people in the Southwest United States than at least the river, the water systems can support?
Well, if you factor in that the river has been 100% drained, you could say that we're way beyond so-called carrying capacity of the landscape.
Yeah.
Now, I brought up previously that the vast majority of the water goes out in irrigated farms. So it starts to get really kind of convoluted to talk about carrying capacity, because the water comes out of the rivers, diverted out of the rivers, pumped out of the rivers, drained out of the river, etc. And it goes to all these farms, and the farms, create food for us and food for cows. Of course, we eat the cows after they make the cows. And the food is shipped all over the United States and in some ways shipped all over the planet. And so, it's common that irrigated agriculture will grow hay, and hay will feed the cattle, and the cattle get raised in a massive feedlot, and the feedlot once every 2 days or whatever will ship 20 trucks of cattle to the slaughterhouse, and the slaughterhouse will slaughter the cattle and cut them up into little 1-pound chunks of ground beef. They'll freeze them and ship them all over the planet. And so the concept of carrying capacity gets I would just say convoluted, and how you actually count carrying capacity is interesting. What that means, I don't know. But, there are plenty of people, including John Wesley Powell, who Powell Reservoir is named after, who's one of the original, dudes who scouted the American West and went down to Colorado. And he has a famous statement, which I'm not going to say correctly, but it was basically like, you can't put people where people weren't meant to be. I mean, it's a very arid landscape. And so we were able to put people here, obviously, because we drained and destroyed all the rivers. And so you can keep putting more and more people if you just want to exchange farms for cities. And then you have to find somewhere else to grow food. So, the whole thing is so convoluted and kind of, polluted, if you will, of the concept of carrying capacity that's kind of hard to talk about it, I think, in a biological sense. But you can certainly talk about, ecological carrying capacity. In other words, is the ecology of the river remotely healthy, and can you keep making demands on it? I would say that it isn't. You can also talk about the social carrying capacity of humans, and that even gets more interesting and provocative. Are we just packing ourselves so tightly in that people don't want to live here anymore? I mean, in many ways, I think here in the state of Colorado, we're kind of seeing what originally happened in California, especially the Los Angeles basin, over the last, 50 years, it just got more and more crowded and more dense. And then people started leaving because it got so expensive, it got so crowded, it became a not nice place to live. And then, there was another story, and I think it was just in the Denver Post, 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago. There are still more people moving into Colorado than are moving out of Colorado, but just barely. There's people are increasingly, fleeing the state because they don't like it anymore. It either got too expensive or it just became too crowded, or, also what comes along with the demographic shift are like cultural shifts. And, sometimes the people who were here before don't like that anymore. I'm rambling a little bit, but, the concept of carrying capacity is a tough one. And you can look at it from a variety of ways, biological, ecological, social. But, I think we definitely don't accept that the Earth has limits, let alone the United States has limits, let alone the state of Colorado has limits. As I said, I don't really see this as like a failing of people as much as it is like just this capitalist growth mindset is really what I call an artificial intelligence. It's baked into the economic and political system, and it's just sort of on autopilot, and it just keeps charging forward.
Hard to get out of that.
Very hard to get out of that, yeah.
Well, I have two more topics that I would really love to touch on.
Okay.
I doubt either of these is going to take us into a positive, happy feeling direction.
That's good, because we do not insist on having a Pollyanna podcast.
True. We're about telling the truth here, aren't we? So One of them is conservation measures. Do they work? Do they have the potential to work? What's kind of been the experience of that? I think people probably have heard of Las Vegas eliminating lawns. And I grew up, in Colorado Springs with you can only water certain days of the week, certain times of the day. And that can kind of go up and down depending on snowpack. And that's the second topic is snowpack. And what is the sort of long-term future for just there being water, given some of the climate trends and changes that we're seeing?
Well, let me say a few things about water conservation. It does work, and it's very effective. What does it get you? Water conservation primarily allows you to stretch water thinner across the landscape. And so if you invest in conservation, you allow more people to use the same amount of water. So you allow more houses and subdivisions and shopping malls to be built with the same amount of water. Now, back to Dave's question, is that a good thing or is that not a good thing? You are using water more efficiently, you might say, but you at the same time allowed the kind of growth machine to continue its autopilot, artificially intelligent march across the landscape. And so, is water conservation necessarily an answer? It's an answer for some kinds of problems. And, here in along the Front Range and especially the metro area and even Colorado Springs, there is water conservation measures. They're much more stringent in the southwest U.S., especially in Las Vegas and in the Tucson, Phoenix, and also in the Los Angeles area, where they actually pay people to take their grass out. They pay you on a square foot basis to remove your grass and to plant drought-tolerant landscaping, like what we call xeriscaping, etc. You don't see that much here in the state of Colorado because they just don't yet. They just haven't gotten that far where they have to stretch the water thinner and thinner. But it's coming if they want to keep growing and growing and using less and less water to do it. Pretty soon you're going to see what we call cash for grass programs sprouting up, for lack of a better word, increasingly across the Front Range because they won't be able to get water anymore out of the rivers because the rivers are already over appropriated and they can't get any more, or the farmers won't sell, or the price just gets too high. And it's always much cheaper to conserve water than it is to build new dams and diversions. But the water utilities do conservation kind of as a last resort, and they just haven't gotten to last resort place yet. So, that's partly touches on your issue of conservation in terms of water conservation. Snowpack, I'm not a climate scientist, but I pay attention to them, and they are all predicting warmer and drier climate in the southwest United States. Along the Front Range of Colorado, where we live, you may not necessarily get less precipitation, it might just be warmer and you get more rain rather than snow. But all the modeling I have seen, the farther south and west you get, you're going to get less rain and snow and warmer. And, the kind of thing we're seeing on the Colorado River right now, which goes back to what Dave was said, part of the reason why the two reservoirs are at historic lows, the precipitation over the last winter, it wasn't terrible. It was about 75% of average, I think, or something like that. But runoff into the reservoirs is going to be less than 50% or even worse because the ground gets so warm and dry that it absorbs the water and you don't get the runoff like you used to. And so people think snowpack, less snow. But it's actually more than just snowpack. It's also the temperature. If it gets warmer, you get more evaporation. You get the ground becomes warmer, it becomes drier, and it absorbs more water, and so you get less runoff into the river. None of those things are good. To my knowledge, according to the climate scientists, who are going the right direction, and they're only predicting worse, not better.
So this quote-unquote mega drought doesn't sound like it's going to end anytime, ever. How do you feel about that even being labeled a drought?
Climate change is a very contested topic. And, what's an interesting thing going on right now in the Southwest United States, there's 7 states. Let's see, 1, 2, 3 of those are what we call red states. 4 of those are what we call blue states. And, are kind of leaning in the middle, where the red states don't use the word climate change and don't believe in it. I'm just saying what the facts are. And the blue states, do use the word climate change and do believe in it. And so in that, kind of milieu, it's better to use the word drought and mega drought because everyone believes that there has been a mega drought because it's easy to prove. Here's what the water was. Here's what it is now. Okay, there's been a drought. If you say it's been a long-term drought, okay, it's been a mega drought, well, okay. Is it going to keep going or not? Well, then you get into like contested terrain of climate science and climate change. But, at this point, people are okay with the term drought and mega drought, and so they're sticking with that because it allows them to try to, negotiate and make a difference.
Fascinating.
Yes, it is.
I started to say this and then I ended up asking a different question, but I talked about your being an environmentalist, being a river protector. And I want to say you're a pretty prolific writer. And in fact, we only have to put one link really in the show notes, and that is to your website where you have done a pretty terrific job of listing, I think, close to everything you've written on the subject of rivers and the subject of population. So I'm segueing into this population thing. So you've been pretty outspoken about the role that human numbers play in what we're doing. And I think you've also been outspoken about the fact that very few people in the environmental movement have been comfortable talking about population, at least in the last 30 years. How has that been received? What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I'll tell a quick story. I think it was about 2019, 2020. I actually had a podcast like this one. It was on EarthX. EarthX is based out of Dallas, and there's a kind of a famous, wealthy guy who runs it. It's called Trammell Crow, and it's a TV station. And I had a TV show for a year, and it was called Overcoming Overshoot.
Yeah.
And I was very excited when it started because it was based on a very famous book by a colleague of mine named Tom Butler. It was all about overpopulation, overpollution, overshoot. And so it was exciting to me that I was going to, have this TV show on EarthX. They're kind of a national platform, so to speak. And we had 12 episodes over a year. I think it was 12 or 13. And I had a lot of leaders of the environmental community on the show as guests, just like you're having me on the show here as a guest. And some very consequential journalists who write for the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very excited about it because I was talking about the root cause, which is growth and population growth, right? And I was like, okay, this is it. I'm at this state in my career where I'm going to start talking about root causes. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to get more followers and I'm going to become an influencer like my good friend Dave Gardner on GrowthBusters. Well, fascinatingly, the exact opposite happened. I was telling the story that basically, most people in the environmental community don't want to hear and don't want to talk about and don't want to watch podcasts about. Nothing personal, against the work you're doing. But it was an interesting thing where you thought, maybe your followers and your influence would grow, and the opposite happened. And even to the point where, if you talk about population, it's a very difficult political environment to talk about population. I meant that the growth machine is baked into the political, system here in Colorado as much as anywhere. And it doesn't matter which political party you're on, et cetera. They're all kind of pro-growth. And so if you're against growth, you're a strange person. Among other names you might be called, you would definitely be called a strange person. I was talking about things that the environmental community didn't want to talk about. Now I'm going to just add to that a very important point. And I'm going to pause and sound dramatic at the same time. When you run public opinion polls, professional public opinion polls in the United States and here in Colorado, and one was run back in 2020, I believe, the majority of the public agrees with us that they do not want more growth and they want growth to slow. There was a very consequential poll by Rasmussen Reports, which is a famous national political pollster. Uh-huh. And depending on how the questions were asked and what the question was, it was between 65% and 90% of the people, and a perfectly scientific randomized poll, between 65% and 90% of the people, of the respondents, wanted growth to be slower or didn't want growth at all in the state of Colorado. And so while, fascinatingly, the growth machine is baked into the political, artificially intelligent algorithm, the vast majority of people, certainly a strong majority, and in many ways a vast majority of people, don't want it. They don't want the traffic. They don't want the congestion. They don't want standing in lines. They don't want to have to, sit in a traffic jam for 3 hours to get to up I-70 to go skiing. Or they, have to take shuttle buses everywhere because you can't drive your car anymore. Or just the dramatic rising costs of housing, etc. And if you ask them, questions about protecting rivers and protecting landscapes, protecting wildlife, and protecting the ecological health, they're also very positive and in tune with those things. So, I just want to go back, and I may have deviated somewhat off your question, but the reason why I actually like this concept, which we hear about all the time, is artificial intelligence and algorithms. I believe growth has become an algorithm. It's like an artificial intelligence. It's baked into the political, the legal, and the financial economic structure to the point where people don't want it. It doesn't serve the purposes that we want it to serve, and we're just sort of stuck on this, train going down the tracks. And so it's a fascinating time, which really kind of congealed, to me around when that really, serious professional poll came out, and I had this TV show at the same time, and you're just telling stories that they're not being marketed because no advertisers want to tell a story about the problems of growth because, of course, products depend on growth, right? And so you're telling like an anti-story. And so I apologize that I'm digging in deep here, but I really like this concept, and I'm going to add one more point to it. I like this concept of the algorithm and the artificial intelligence and how it's really kind of taken over the economic system and the political system. Because about a decade ago, I realized that I wasn't fighting people. When I fight an agency like Denver Water or Northern Water or the city of Fort Collins or the city of Colorado Springs, I'm in damn battles with the city of Colorado Springs where you guys are from. Of course there are people working there, and of course they're nice people, but that whole agency and the structure doesn't act like a person. They don't feel things. They don't internalize things. They're very much like robots. It's baked into their structure. Growth, do whatever you need to do to keep growing, and that's what we do. And that's what the votes on the city councils do. That's what, therefore, the Colorado Springs Water Utility is told to do. And they go out and they buy more water rights or appropriate more water rights, and they're trying to build, 2 or 3 dams right now that I'm in various stages of battle with. what I realized, in order to be successful and also to be a happy, joyful person and semi-sane, I have to behave like a robot myself. And so I stopped internalizing a lot of these fights, and I just sort of started doing and saying what needed to happen. And so I'm in all these various lawsuits and various permitting processes. We put comments in. And if you look at me, I think I'm a fairly joyful, happy person. I'm 64 years old. I'm not burnt out at all. I wake up every day. I get exercise. I feel good about what I'm trying to do. You win, lose, or draw. I like to sleep well, and I try to make a difference. It's because I had to start behaving like the thing, literally it's a thing, that I was up against. And again, it is a kind of artificial intelligence. It's like a robot. And, I think once you sort of flip into that mindset, it becomes, a different sort of battle that we're in, and becomes a different, concept of like how you, wage war in that battle. And, it kind of goes back to one of your points, Dave, when you're asking about speaking out about population growth, or even with the reaction of the environmental community, talking about things they don't want to talk about. I talk about things people don't want to talk about all the time, but I don't think I do it in a really aggressive or in-your-facey kind of way. I do it sort of in a robotic kind of way, because I think it's necessary to oppose the thing, the it that we're up against. And so I keep a fair amount of joy and upbeatness, even though I'm 64 years old, and intend to keep doing this fight because I like doing it, and I think I'm making a difference. And interestingly, I think the more I act similarly like an artificial intelligence, in some ways the more difference I make, because I'm just out there every day, almost like a robot. You just wake up, do the job, boom, 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 make these 5 calls, file these comments, file this lawsuit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just become almost robotic in it, and maybe that's the way to fight this thing.
Well, I knew that. I just wasn't sure I could get you to say that.
Yeah.
It's almost like an armor. It's an armor or like an alter ego that you're accessing to do this work and not burn out and not take all of the things in such a personal, negative way, because it is a slog. It is an uphill battle. You've been at it for many years. So whatever it takes for Gary Wockner to get up out of bed and go fight the good fight, I'm a fan of.
Amen. And I never in a million years imagined that this is what you would be telling us. And it's something I think I needed to hear. So thank you.
I don't know if it's useful or not, and I'm not sure if it's ultimately healthy. But, I think and one of the other things I'd like to leave you with is we're constantly inundated with these stories in the media about technology and technology billionaires. And here in the state of Colorado, as you know, part of the demographic shift has been that the economy has become more tech-oriented. And there's this whole story that young people are being told and fed about, the path to success is through making extraordinary amounts of money in the tech business. Mm-hmm. And there's a never-ending and a constantly escalating way that you can make money in tech. I'm not an expert in that. And of course, the biggest new one is artificial intelligence. Maybe it's not that new, but you just hear about it. If you dare read the newspaper or the Wall Street Journal, which I do every day, I have an interest in that sort of stuff, you read about tech, AI, and just the money swirling around it every day. And I'm partially involved in this because, data centers are big electricity users.
Yeah.
They're also big water users.
Yeah.
And so my professional life circles around the energy and water use of data centers, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think one of the things I'm proud in some ways of the settlement that occurred on the Cache la Poudre River in northern Colorado, because, and I personally did it. Now we have a board, but I personally did it, and I fought for it, and it wasn't an easy battle. It went on for quite a while. But we got to this number, $100 million, that is now in a fund, or will be put in a fund over the next, 15 years. Part of it's been put in the fund already to improve the river. So this is a very different story than young people are hearing now. The story that inundates the airwaves is how to make $100 million for you, and to buy a bigger house, and to buy a yacht, and to become one of these tech bros who just has this, wild life of money and technology and artificial intelligence and data centers and yada, yada. Well, I'm happy that I'm able to tell an alternative story. I hope some young people watch this, that you can dedicate your life to something else, and you can also reach a 9-digit number, $100 million, that is going to get spent on ecological protection and restoration. And so that's part of the story I want to be able to tell too. Again, I think it was partly achieved because I went into this almost robotic mode. I was like, oh, $1 billion is not that much money. You read about $1 billion every day. And this project's going to cost $2 billion. Okay, if it's going to cost $2 billion, they should spend at least $100 million. And so I didn't really, internalize the concept of $100 million. I mean, it's an astonishing amount of money. But if you want to change one diversion structure, where as I talked about, the farmers divert the water off the river, if you want to change one of those, it can cost $10 million or $15 million. And so $100 million doesn't actually go that far if you actually talk about changing the infrastructure of a river. And so one of the things I'm also involved in is trying to raise more money for that fund. So, maybe we can get it to $150 million, even $200 million. And so you can really start making dramatic infrastructural change that includes improving the ecological health of the river. So that's a story, I think that young people need to hear as well as just being constantly inundated with these tech billionaires and their fantastical stories about how artificial intelligence is going to make everyone so much money. There's alternative stories out there as well.
Wouldn't you feel better if you had just, placed an order for a mega yacht?
Well, I joke, I and my organization, Save the Pooter, get zero of the money. I just want to be clear about that. We purposely did not and do not get any of the money. But it's not my scene. Mega yachts are not my scene. I've been on yachts. They're pretty cool. Not a mega yacht, but, a small yacht. But it's not how I wanted to spend my life. I just don't have an interest in making money. I have an interest in protecting the environment. It's where my interest in. It's what my whole professional life has been in. It's what I went to college for. And so it's just what I do. And it'll run out at some point. But I'm still enjoying doing it.
We're glad you're doing it, Gary.
Yeah, you're a champion, and I thank you. And I feel really good about this conversation and sharing it widely. So thanks for spending your time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, that was quite a conversation with Gary. I don't think I oversold him, did I?
No, he was awesome.
Just a couple of real quick things as we wrap up. I do want to share a little bit of listener feedback on YouTube to episode 90, our episode with Matt Orsog about degrowth. We had an interesting comment by Luker Denouncer. He or she wrote, "The economy doesn't need to grow, but this podcast and channel definitely does." I thought that was pretty cool. But it also made me look up the definition to lucre.
I don't think it was obvious to me initially.
The definition of lucre, that's L-U-C-R-E, is money, especially when regarded as sordid or distasteful or gained in a dishonorable way. So that's pretty interesting. The comment again was, the economy doesn't need to grow, but this podcast and channel definitely does. And I couldn't agree more, obviously. So how do we grow this podcast?
Well, one way that I can think of would be to share this episode with people you love or anyone, honestly, that needs to learn about the limits to growth. Sharing this is the best way to share our message and grow the number of people that are listening.
Clearly, you could share it with your mayor, your governor, U.S. or state representative or senator, or if you're somewhere else outside the U.S., your prime minister, president, journalists. There are so many people who really need to, really wise up about limits to growth. So share with them.
Yep. And also don't forget to subscribe or follow the podcast on your podcast app of choice, as well as on YouTube. And that way you won't miss any future episodes.
Yeah. And follow GrowthBusters on Facebook and Blue Sky, and GrowthBusting on Instagram. And those are places you can like our posts and share them as well.
Also, don't forget to click the donate button at growthbusters.org. We're a listener-funded podcast, so we appreciate that support.
And I just want to really thank, if you're already a supporter and you have been donating annually, maybe for years and years, or you're one of the monthly automatic donors to the GrowthBusters project, thank you so much. That means a lot. And I see those notices come in that your funds went into the bank, and we couldn't do it without you. So thanks. And one last thanks to Jake Fader for writing and producing the GrowthBusters theme, which you hear at the open and close of this podcast, and to Carlos Jones for singing it very well.
Thanks for listening, sharing, and doing your part. We've got a planet to save.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters.